For the next couple of days, well, for the next few days actually, as a way to wrap up our semester, we're going to focus on African American drama, African American theater. Um, and there is a challenge when we start thinking about African American theater in literary terms, because one of the interesting phenomena that has happened fairly recently in the span of literary analysis and literary practice is um, is how little attention is given to drama when we start thinking about the body of work that constitutes a literary body of work for a nation, for a group, and so on. And so one of the benefits and one of the values of the Norton anthology is that it does pay attention to drama, and it does pay attention to that form of literature. And it is, of course, an important form of literature. I think some of the hallmarks of English literature and English studies are, the plays of Dryden, Shakespeare, Marlowe, and Beckett, till we come into the modern era. So in other words, it's impossible to think of the literature, the body of work that constitutes a literary body of work, without thinking about what happens in drama and what happens in theater. The fascinating thing about theater is, of course, when we read it as literature, what we should always bear in mind is that we are reading what is essentially a transcript of something that is performed. Theater is fundamentally written to be performed, it's to be seen on stage, and it's to be viewed on stage. And so, what comes to us as the text that we're going to read, whether we're reading Ntasaka Shanje, or we're reading August Wilson, or we're reading Lorraine Hansberry, is a record of what was done on the stage. But of course, that record is articulated through the wonderful possibilities of literature and literary practice. The other thing to keep in mind is that the drama is fundamentally about dialogue and action. Dialogue and action drives drama. And so when we think about the metaphorical functions of language, we also should think about the metaphorical functions of staging, what happens on the stage. It's one thing to say the characters say one thing and they discuss things amongst themselves, and we see a plot that unfolds and a story that sort of opens up before us. But it's another thing to remember that what is not necessarily fully articulated or written in would be the set, would be the ways in which an object can become a fantastic symbol of great meaning and great importance to the work. And of course, the thing that we can least prepare for when we're just reading the text is the silent expressions, the unspoken expressions, the ways in which the expression, the acting, as it were, conveys feeling, meaning, and ideas. So, what we have to do when we're reading a play is to read within the subtext of what the language is saying. And the subtext is sort of found in imagining ourselves seeing the work being performed before us and then trying to understand what is happening there. Now, this is important, and of course, in all the plays that we're looking at, they all have very, very clear styles and approaches, and they represent different moments in African American literary practice. Um, I've chosen to look at the plays that follow the chronology of what we've been reading. So we read work that has taken us into the 1940s and the 1950s, really to the 1940s. And so the plays now begin in the 1950s. And we're going to begin with Lorraine Hansberry's A Raisin in the Sun. And that will take us right up until the 1990s, when we look at August Wilson's Joe Turner's Come and Gone. And that takes us through the entire century, looking at the plays as the way to take us through the rest of the century. And I think these are important plays that tell us a great deal about African American life and African American experience. The other thing to think about in the history of drama in America is American theater is very interesting because, of course, um, theater, at least in its current manifestation, is an expensive proposition. Plays have to be staged. Audiences have to come to this theater. They have to pay their money to the theater. Actors have to be paid. And the staging of plays is a very involved process. And one of the things that happened with um, African American culture and experience is that, to a large extent, from the mainstream theater, whether it's on Broadway, the African American theater did not always get a great deal of access and great deal of attention. And even in contemporary times, when we think of African American theater, we have to always think, even more so than in books and so on, about the audience who comes to see these plays. And what we'll see is that in plays like Lorraine Hansberry's A Raisin in the Sun, and in plays like Joe Turner's Come and Gone by August Wilson, despite all the efforts to think about a black audience and a black patron of theater, for many of these plays, the audiences were primarily white audiences. The audiences on Broadway are primarily white people who go to see the plays and not necessarily African Americans. And yet, African American playwrights are writing with the African American audience in mind. But are they? And this becomes one of the interesting questions and the interesting complications of the work that we're dealing with. And it will be one of the questions that we start asking ourselves when we think of the plays. When I come back, we're going to sort of do a brief history of the development of African American theater, that helps us to frame our discussion of Lorraine Hansberry, Raisin in the Sun. We'll talk a little bit about her work and so on.